as you reach this video, hopefully you have had a chance to really work through, both in reading and in your thinking, Section 3 of the class notes, the procedure of our Bible study method. We have spent some time working through the method to apply, which hopefully you realize by now is the grammatical contextual method, that you understand why that method, what its parts are, how those parts work, or at least are beginning to understand that and see some of the practicalities of that. On pages 67 through 80 of your notes, there is just an extended section on various methods that you should avoid. Methods that people use, whether they're consciously using them or unconsciously using them, that I would suggest you are inconsistent with not just this method, but the principles that drive this method. And so in this, I list out, I think there's 12 different methods. One of your class assignments, if you haven't already done that, is to talk about the two that you may be most prone to repeat. And one of your discussion questions will be to discuss that together, because I think it's good to hear from other people how methods that maybe they read that and go, boy, I've been guilty of that. And let them talk it through, and then you guys can interact together. In this video, I want to just take a couple of minutes to just talk about a couple that I find that are fairly prevalent in the church today, that people haven't really thought a lot about. And maybe you yourself, I know myself, I've been guilty of this in the past. One of them is what we call the proof texting approach. The proof texting approach. This is so incredibly prevalent. We do this all the time. Basically, the proof texting approach is just exactly what it is. You have an idea, or exactly how it sounds. You have an idea, then you find a verse that proves your idea. So your idea says X, and then what you do is you come over here and you find a whole bunch of verses that support that idea. The difficulty with that is not that having verses written out in parentheses are bad, but most of the time I find that people who do that and they'll quote a string of scriptures have not spent any time actually looking at the text and answering the question whether it truly proves the point that you're making. And so what we're trying to get you to do in this course is to think through, let's first do exegesis before we talk about application. But I find a lot of times we have to have answers to questions, so we go out there and we find verses that support it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So be careful of that. I tell people in class that a lot of times if you'll see a statement, where they'll say something from the Bible, and then they'll follow it by a whole bunch of verses. And sometimes those verses will be this long. I remember reading a particular book one time. They were trying to prove a particular point, and they would make a statement, then they would put almost a paragraph of verses. Well, that's an incredibly intimidating thing. If you're reading that and you go, they just made this statement and it's supported by all those verses, it's incredibly intimidating, because the thing is, most of the time, people don't go look those verses up. They don't go look it up and actually see if those verses are consistent with the statement. They sure don't take the time to really look at those verses in context. So I tell people all the time, just kind of as a general rule, the more verses that are behind it, the more you ought to be suspicious of it. And just be careful. It doesn't mean that the verses that are out there don't support that statement, but we should just be careful of that, because it's too easy to quote the Bible, but be quoting the Bible in a way that's not consistent with what the Bible is actually saying. And at the end of the day, what's the problem with that? Is we're misquoting God, right? The second one that I would throw up here, and again, I'm not saying that you guys are doing this. You might read through this and go, boy, I'm not guilty of these two. These are just two that I have found that people struggle with. The other one is what is known as the cross-referencing approach. The cross-referencing approach. And you know how that is. You've got 2 pages of the Bible, and in between that, you'll have a page, or maybe right down the middle of one of your pages are a set of a whole bunch of verses that are referenced out, A or B. And so you'll be reading a verse, and there'll be a little note there that references you to that cross-reference, and then they'll have a bunch of verses written out there. And so, for instance, let's say maybe the word salvation is used in a particular passage. And then all of a sudden it has a little A up there. Well, you go look up that A, and it'll take you to a whole string of verses. And you can just kind of keep, I call it the zigzag approach, where you're reading here, and then you're in a passage here, and you're in a passage here, and a passage here. And you go, man, all of those verses about salvation. It's really exciting. It's a lot of fun. It keeps your brain active and your hands moving. But the problem is, and hopefully by now you're starting to kind of put some of these together, the problem is the danger of taking those statements out of context. Just to use this word alone, it can have multiple different aspects of meaning depending on how the author is using it in the context in which he is writing. It doesn't even matter if you're referencing. You might say, well, that's okay because I just moved from Ephesians to Colossians. But remember, Paul was writing to someone when he wrote Ephesians. He was writing to someone when he wrote Colossians. He was writing to someone when he wrote Thessalonians. And we need to make sure that we allow the author the freedom, if you will, to say what he was actually being led of God to say. And so the danger with the cross-referencing approach, if I can reuse these boxes here, is the idea of taking passage A and cross-referencing it with passage B, and all of a sudden all we've done is taken two passages of Scripture and squished them together and just kind of made them this. Just kind of squish them together. Oftentimes we'll say, well, this is a hard one to interpret, so I'll go here and I'll interpret this. And the problem is we do the same thing when we're here and we let this interpret, and we've just kind of mixed them together. What I tell people to do, and I'll come out here, and I realize that what I'm going to suggest to you is much, much more work. But if you have passage A, you're bound to do the hard work of exegesis, to let the meaning of passage A in its context to come to the surface, to really be understood. And then, if time even will allow you, to do the hard work of exegesis in passage B, and to allow the meaning of that passage to come to bear. And so instead of trying to interpret them together and squishing them, you interpret them separately. Let the meaning come to the surface, and then compare whether they're actually emphasizing the same truth or not. What you find is instead of kind of a squished together, blurry, kind of everything says the same thing over and over kind of view of Scripture, you start to see that in this passage maybe they're talking about the same thing, but he's emphasizing one aspect. Here he's talking about the same thing but emphasizing another aspect, and what you get is a fuller, more well-rounded view of whatever subject that you may be dealing with. I realize that takes time. I realize that takes a lot of work. It may not give you all the answers that you want as quickly as you want them, but I tell people this all the time. One of the great things about exegesis, if you really commit yourself to following the principles taught in this course, letting it form into a method of approaching exegesis consistent, it'll slow you down. You won't have all the answers you want as quickly as you want. But what it does is it keeps you at the feet of the Lord, continuously looking to Him, growing in Him. And what you find when you truly find the meaning of a passage is that it's a richness within your heart and within your mind. And that at the end of the day, we're not looking to have all the answers. Because we know that there is a danger with having so much knowledge so quickly that it makes us arrogant. What we really want to do is not necessarily have all the answers, but to know the Lord in such a way that we're being conformed into His very image. That's the great thing about exegesis. If really, truly applied, it keeps us from kind of mixing the truth together. Let the fullness of truth come out and will transform us from the inside out. Okay? So read through this if you haven't already. Spend some time really thinking through some of the methods that you may be prone to apply yourself. Think through why that is, how you're going to avoid it, why it's inconsistent with what we've been encouraging you to think through this semester. And these two, again, I just put out there as two that I find people really being prone to themselves.